Hello, and welcome back to Checkmate, Atun Shei, the series where I fulfill my calling by reviewing the most appalling Civil War series on YouTube, Checkmate Link Knights. In today's episode, we look into the 6th episode of Checkmate Link Knights, titled, Were There Really Black Confederates? The topic is not one I've discussed extensively for two specific reasons. Firstly, the entire argument regarding Black Confederates is not worth the effort. The reason for why the entire Black Confederate talking point came about was as a means of appealing to, and attempting to counteract, the accusation of the South being evil by using the tried and true method of labeling them as racist and or white supremacist. There are two issues with trying to appease said crowd. First, this line of argumentation is playing the game based on their terms that they can liberally alter whenever it suits their purposes. Secondly, even if you can present them solid evidence that is difficult for them to refute, they will still do so either way and continue to insist the South is evil based on any specific point they take issue with. In no uncertain terms, the argument is pointless as the opposition does not care to hear the argument. Secondly, and just as important, the entire argument is dominated by semantics and wordplay. No one seemingly has a concrete definition about what they wish to talk about, thus devolving into both parties talking over the other person's head. Without properly defining what is a Black Confederate, no civil discourse can take place, and therefore all arguments pertaining to it become meaningless minutiae. A similar situation exists for determining what exactly a soldier is. With that being said, before we can even begin analyzing the video, I wish to provide a concise definition for what a Black Confederate is and what a soldier is. For the purposes of this video, a Black Confederate is a man of color, specifically of African heritage, who was within one of the armies of the Confederate States of America, whether that be conducting manual labor, serving in a home guard, or in other combat or non-combat roles within an army. As for what is a soldier is a man who operates within an army, whether they be a combatant or non-combatant, and serves as an integral part of the Army's daily operations. This can include cooks, medics, logistics personnel, and frontline troops, to name a few roles. With that being said, let us begin. The episode begins with, oddly enough, a Christmas theme.
Did somebody say Christmas?
Maybe.
Is it Christmas already?
No. It's July.
Even better! I'm getting the Christmas tree up, Bootsy! We'll sing Christmas carols, we'll read the best Christmas stories, and I'll even get Jacob Marley over!
Isn't Jacob Marley supposed to be, dead?
Bootsy, you underestimate my capabilities. I'll invite you over when I'm finished.
Okay. In either case, the opening for this is rather quaint. It's definitely an improvement over the openings of the other episodes, yet I can't enjoy it. After he thoroughly tainted my enjoyment of his series from the first 5 previous episodes, I simply cannot find any enjoyment out of this. Even so, the same dry humor is still there, but just with a Christmas overlay, as per usual. After a little under 3 minutes of this, he finally gets into the topic of the video. Within 2 minutes, the evident problem with this whole discussion becomes apparent as Atun Shei argues from a wholly different definition from what I would use when discussing the topic. In Atun Shei's eyes, and the eyes of countless people, both laymen and well-learned historians, a soldier is someone who serves in the army and must be a combatant, i.e. they must fight. In fact, a source he uses comes from renowned historian Gary Gallagher, who, in 2014, directly addressed said question. Atun Shei uses a small part of the overall statement in his video to corroborate his point, though, for the sake of all here, I will show the whole section where he addresses the question.
So let's talk about black soldiers, or the role of African Americans in the war. A kid growing up in the South in the 60s, the 70s, even into the 80s, I think, learning about the Civil War was under the impression that there were no black people involved in the Civil War on either side. And then 25 years ago, the movie Glory came along, and we learned that, oh, there were black soldiers
Incredibly important.
on the United States side. But now, in the last, since then, we've now had the Sons of Confederate Veterans and all sorts of other neo-Confederate organizations now make the case that there were huge numbers of African Americans fighting for the South. Yeah. Everybody wants black people in their army now.
Well, the Black Confederate movement, which, as I said earlier, is demented, is an effort to get the Confederacy right on race retrospectively. And you just need to stop that. Anybody who's trying to do it, just stop it. Stop it right now, because you can't win that. What is true is that there were thousands of black men with Confederate armies. That's been airbrushed out too, but they're slaves. And they are with the Army doing all kinds of things the Army needs to have done. They are not serving in the Confederate armies. They are not Confederate soldiers. They are slaves who are there. There would have been thousands of slaves with the Army in Northern Virginia at any given time.
Primarily doing what?
They could have been working as teamsters, they could have been working as cooks, they could have been doing the laundry, they could have been doing all kinds of non-combatant things that need to be done in an army. In 1864, Lee told Jefferson Davis, every white man in the Army, I'm paraphrasing, who isn't shouldering a musket should be replaced by a slave. And so the white man can shoulder a musket. We need our white men fighting. Slaves can do all the rest of this. And Jefferson Davis agreed. And eventually they got to the point where they even considered putting some slaves in the Confederate Army. That was way, way late and didn't make any difference. But black men took care of a lot of the work, just as they did in the United States armies too. There would have been a lot of black men laboring in non-combatant roles before the black soldiers showed up. But the idea that there are thousands and thousands and thousands, I've seen a number as high as 100,000 black soldiers in the Confederate Army. I know what Robert E. Lee would have said to that. He would have said, oh, give me some of them, because I'm running out of white soldiers. Where are all these black soldiers in the Confederate Army? They weren't there. Doesn't mean that some black man at some point didn't pick up a musket and fire at a Yankee. I'm sure that happened when we're talking about so many men. But the black soldiers in the Confederate Army thing, just no.
For both men, they are arguing from a strict definition of what a soldier is, a definition that can be argued as too narrow due to the nature of armies in general. For instance, in the modern United States military, a considerable portion of its active duty forces are in fact in non-combatant roles, namely in logistics and technician roles. There is also the medical and chaplain corps, which, like the others, are non-combatant roles, though are critical in the function of the military. In fact, Desmond Doss, a conscientious objector, acted as medic during the Second World War in the Pacific Theater. During the Battle of Okinawa, Desmond Doss personally retrieved over 75 wounded men from the battlefield, helping save their lives when they otherwise would have perished. For his action there, he became the only conscientious objector to be awarded the Medal of Honor. This is why I reject the strict definition of what is a soldier, as the definition can be used against those who have served in the United States military, or any military, and refute them as being such. This is why the distinction between combatant and non-combatant exists within the modern lexicon so as to better clarify a person's role in the military. You may be asking, but Boots, many of these men were slaves. How could you consider them to be a part of the Confederate Army when they had no choice on the matter? To answer this question, we need to look back towards historical precedents established by a civilization that the founders of the United States, and many during the American Civil War, often looked towards for inspiration: the Romans. You see, the Roman legions were broken down into cohorts, and finally the smallest field unit of the Roman legion, the century. The sentry consisted of 80 fighting men, which, at first, doesn't add up. After all, how can you call a unit of 80 men a sentry when a sentry is made up of 100 units? The answer is rather simple. A sentry consisted of 80 fighting men and 20 non-combatants. The 20 men, consisting of a mix of free men and slaves, were incorporated into the structure of the sentry. Their purpose was to assist in the logistical tasks necessary for operating and maintaining a sentry's fighting condition. This specific task consisted of conducting the many camp chores, from cooking, washing clothes, setting up and breaking down camp, digging defensive works, handling the pack animals, and countless other tasks that otherwise the fighting men would have to do themselves. Without the assistance of such logistics personnel, the fighting men of the sentry would have to conduct these tasks while also attempting to remain in a battle-ready condition for extended periods of time, placing even greater physical and mental strain on them. Even though they weren't expected to fight, their role in the sentry, and in turn the Legion as a whole, was indispensable for its daily operations. Hence their inclusion directly into the military structure and constant presence throughout the existence of the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire. In no uncertain terms, men who fulfill these roles within an army are considered to be a part of that army. This is what Atun Shei and countless others fail to grasp or willfully ignore. You do not have to fight to be considered a part of the army. Shortly after this, Johnny Rep brings up the 1st Louisiana Guard, a militia regiment raised in and around New Orleans consisting predominantly of free black men of the city, to which Atun Shei responds by pointing out that said Guard regiment did not fight in combat and was an exception to the rule rather than the rule. He goes on to mention how New Orleans, and Louisiana in general, was different from the rest of the South as they had a different view of the black population in the area. There are two notable problems with this. Firstly, there's the rather blatant dodging of the issue by coming up with excuses for why said militia regiment wasn't completely relevant. Later on in the video, Atun Shei makes the following, rather ironic, statement.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The reason why I bring this up is because, even when presented with about as close to solid evidence as possible for the point Johnny Reb is making, Atun Shei still dismisses it offhand. This prompts an important question. What exactly constitutes as extraordinary evidence? Shouldn't any evidence for a point be considered valid, especially when said evidence is well researched and is hard to refute as such? This mentality regarding evidence is one that's commonplace among atheist circles online as well, the statement being a popular sentiment among the most prominent new atheist figures. In fact, I'd recommend watching Inspiring Philosophy's video pertaining to this exact subject, as he does a better job at denoting how manipulative the statement and its application can be in civil discourse. This touches upon my earlier point regarding why I don't like engaging in this discussion. The progressive opposition does not care for whatever evidence you provide for your point. They will simply dismiss it and fall back to the same tired arguments rather than honestly confront any errors in their judgment and change their minds in an earnest manner. Just as with the new atheist movement, the union-biased progressive will always reject the evidence, even when it is hard to deny. Secondly, there were other regiments of free black men who were raised as volunteers during the early part of the war elsewhere in the South, most notably in the city of Petersburg, a city with a considerable free black population. A volunteer regiment of free black men was raised to aid in the Confederate war effort. However, unlike their white counterparts, they were not permitted to fight as a regular regiment and instead tasked with conducting non-combatant roles for the Confederacy. The reason why they were denied such a role comes down to tradition more than anything else. A common perception throughout this period of time concerned the question of loyalty of non-citizens in the military. Namely, it was commonly viewed that freedmen were not capable of fighting due to having little to no stake in the political and social system they lived under, meaning that they would be less inclined to fight and keep fighting in dire situations. The Romans had much of a similar view, which is why, throughout much of the history of the Roman Republic, non-citizens were barred from serving in combat roles. This view would change under the Marian reforms of the late 2nd century BC, which changed the system from the citizen-soldier army of the early Republic towards a soldier-fortune system of the late Republic and early Empire. Both the North and the South held much of a similar view regarding the capabilities of free black men in their respective regions. Some of it was driven by racial perceptions, though much of it was also driven by the negative perception of non-citizens fighting for the army. When the first United States colored troop regiments were formed in early 1863, they served much the same role as free blacks in the Confederacy, being relegated to logistics roles in the Army. It had taken exceptional amounts of lobbying from men, such as Robert Gould Shaw, colonel of the 54th Massachusetts, to even get them into combat. There was simply a strong reluctance, on both sides, on having free black men engage in combat. As a result, militia units, such as the 1st Louisiana Guard, or free black men who volunteered in aiding the Confederate war effort, never saw combat, but still performed duties necessary for the Army to function. Without their efforts, the Confederacy would have struggled more than it did. As a part of this general response concerning the 1st Louisiana, he mentions the following.
Interestingly, those same men then offered their services to Benjamin Butler, the military governor of the Union occupiers of New Orleans. As Butler's biographer James Parton explained,
So General Butler called on Africa, not upon the slaves, but upon the free colored men of the city, whom General Jackson had enrolled in 1814. He sent for several of the most influential of this class, and conversed freely with them upon this project. He asked them why they had accepted service under the Confederate government, which was set up for the distinctly avowed purpose of holding in eternal slavery their brethren and kindred. They answered that they had not dared to refuse, that they had hoped, by serving the Confederates, to advance a little nearer in equality with whites, and that they longed to throw the weight of their class into the scale of the Union, and only asked an opportunity to show their devotion to the cause with which their own dearest hopes were identified. The general took them at their word.
though General Butler took these guys at their word, we probably shouldn't. The mixed-race free people of color of New Orleans had always viewed themselves as superior to and distinct from slaves and full-blooded blacks, so it's very likely that they were just telling Butler what he wanted to hear. These guys left no written records of this event, so their motivations will probably always remain a mystery, but historical context can give us some clues. New Orleans was the wealthiest and most strategically important city in the entire South, and the Confederate government had relegated pitifully few resources in manpower or materiel to defend it. Though General Lovell would be blamed for basically allowing the Union Navy to capture the city, realistically, there was nothing he could have done to stop them. And after the occupation, even die-hard secessionists had lost all hope that the stainless banner would fly over the Crescent City ever again. Faced with this hard truth, the men of the 1st Louisiana may have realized that they needed to kiss Butler's ring if they had any hope in maintaining their privileged social status.
Now, on his part, he goes through a considerable amount of speculation, but what he neglects to mention is a couple of important details. Firstly, there is no reason to suspect the 3 black men of the city of New Orleans had any real intentions of lying to Butler about their intentions. After all, when referring to the United States colored troops, they stated much the same reason for why they fought for the Union. They wanted to be viewed as equals to their white counterparts. As any minority group living in any country would do, they sought to prove themselves as a valid component of the nation, similar to how the Irish, German, and Jewish populations living in the United States would do, as they, too, were minority groups compared to the Anglican majority the nation had been founded on. Secondly, the reason why they would bring up this point to Butler was so as to avoid Butler's wrath. Something Atun Shei tends to neglect to mention is Benjamin Butler was a mix of both incompetent and brutish. For instance, when he was acting as the head of the occupation force in New Orleans, he issued the infamous General Order No. 28, which states the following. As the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subject to repeated insults from the women, calling themselves ladies, of New Orleans in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered that hereafter when any female shall by word, gesture, or movement insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation. In other words, he called every single woman who showed even a slight amount of contempt for the occupying forces in New Orleans prostitutes, and that they would be held liable by being treated as a prostitute. The order was, understandably, interpreted by many ladies of the city as a legalization of sexual assault of the women of the city. During this period, several women were imprisoned on Ship Island off the coast of Mississippi in terrible conditions due, in part, to violating this order. The order, along with a host of other harsh actions taken by Butler, were the reason for his removal from the command at New Orleans. He would be assigned elsewhere where, with little surprise, he would take his burger binging to new, catastrophic extremes.
I wake up in the morning, I got burgers on my mind. Ketchup, mustard, mayo, fries, lettuce, and number 9. And all these yummy burgers tasty, trying to get me off my grind. But I can't let them do it, I got burgers on my mind. Bitch, I got burgers on my mind. I got burgers on my mind. I got burgers on my mind. Burgers on my mind. Burgers on my mind. I got burgers on my mind. I got burgers on my mind. I got burgers on my mind.
But, in either case, it is likely the reason why the black population of the city kissed Benjamin Butler's burger grease-covered boots was to keep him satisfied and to prevent him from suspecting any form of Southern sympathies. If any form of deception could be taken away from this series of events, it would simply be that. It's not long after this that he continues his speculative argumentation, but this time over a specific example that's become iconic to the wider public. In this photograph is Andrew Chandler with his family manservant, Silas Chandler. The photograph was taken in 1861, prior to Andrew's departure with the 44th Mississippi Infantry Regiment to join with the Army of the Tennessee. During the Battle of Chickamauga, Andrew Chandler was wounded in the leg, which required serious medical attention. Silas, who had remained by the side of his master throughout all of this, took his wounded master back home, where he received better treatment than he would have at the makeshift field hospitals on the battlefield or in Atlanta. Silas's actions in the end saved Andrew from losing his leg permanently and likely saved him from death, as amputations of this nature often had a high mortality rate. They both survived the war and would go on to live long lives, still residing in Clay County, Mississippi, well into the 20th century. Silas would apply for a pension for his service rendered in the Confederate States Army, which Andrew stood as a witness for said service. Silas passed away at the age of 82 in 1919, while Andrew passed away in 1920 at the age of 74. This photograph, along with the entire story regarding Silas Chandler, has been a constant stir of controversy for virtually everyone involved. Atun Shei tries to tackle this by making much the same mistake everyone else he referenced has made in this debate, trying to speculate a motive for Silas's actions. When confronted with the story of Silas's life and his actions to save Andrew's leg from being amputated, I come from it with a simple understanding. I cannot know anyone's motives for their actions, and therefore should not speculate on why. According to Atun Shei and his not so unbiased sources, it was likely he only did it just because he didn't want to risk his wife and newly born son being punished. However, it would just be as likely that Silas cared about Andrew, along with his younger brother Benjamin, just as any good moral man ought to, and went above and beyond to help someone he considered a friend, in spite of their differences in social standing. It could even be a combination of multiple things that contributed to Silas's actions during the war and his unwavering loyalty to Andrew and Benjamin Chandler. But we will never know. The mistake Atun Shei and the sources he uses make is always presuming a motive that best suits their agenda at the time. For Atun Shei, and the man who wrote the BuzzFeed article he heavily drew upon, it is an ideological game they seek to play by asserting that no enslaved man could have ever been loyal, that they must all secretly hate their masters and view them as a pejorative evil. They cannot even propose the notion that Silas was simply loyal to his master and did care about him. After all, Silas would have known Andrew and Benjamin throughout his entire life, and the both of them would have known Silas throughout their entire lives. Regardless of any social differences, such a close relationship would still foster feelings of companionship, of a sense of familiarity between one another. When we refer back to the photograph of Andrew and Silas, you can see a strong sense of close companionship, that Andrew, more likely than not, viewed Silas as a friend more than he did as a mere slave. In spite of whatever motivation Silas may have had, his actions can only be described as truly virtuous, upholding the ideals of the Christian faith. To quote from Ephesians 6, 5-8, "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and singleness of your heart, as unto Christ, not with eye service as man-pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service, as to the Lord, and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free." There can be no fault found in Silas, as he did what any good man should do in such a social situation: serve wholeheartedly. By doing this, regardless of what specific motivation he may or may not have had, Silas cannot be criticized, but admired as a truly good man. However, those who hold views similar to Atun Shei would find fault in it in some way, shape, or form. Throughout this entire point, he tries to propose better explanations that, in the end, aren't much better than the simplest explanation. Silas cared about Andrew just as any respectable, decent person would do. This discussion exposes a fundamental belief that people, like Atun Shei, hold: that the slavery dynamic supersedes everything. This belief completely erodes away the humanity of both the enslaved population and the humanity of their masters, rendering them into nothing more than the meaningless cogs in a system rather than people, with their beliefs and ideals, who can do things in their own way, shape, or form. It is the stripping away of humanity that makes Atun Shei's arguments, and that of his source material, ironic. They often argue about humanizing the enslaved population, but in the process, they have dehumanized all involved, both the slave and their master. It is an inhuman worldview, which might explain the cold, callous beliefs of people like Atun Shei. From this point, he bounces off of it to discuss the question of the loyalty of said slaves, which he encapsulates by arguing that said slaves were not loyal whatsoever more often than not, and sought to escape to freedom when they could. I won't deny this happened, as it did occur, though it's worth noting that many were also loyal, Silas being a prime example of this. As I often say, the truth often lies somewhere in the middle of the extremes. There were loyal slaves, as there were disloyal slaves. There were cruel masters, just as there were compassionate masters. When we try to paint these things with a broad stroke, we often end up diminishing the humanity of these individuals, often failing to understand them as individuals. In this, he also states that there is no wartime perspective of the enslaved population. meaning that it was often filtered by their masters. When I heard this, I thought to myself, well, if there's no wartime accounts, why not refer to post-war accounts by said people? After all, there were a host of such men who gave their thoughts on the war in the post-war years. Are these not valid sources in their own right? Then again, Atun Shei would dismiss such evidence offhand as not extraordinary and continue to double down on his position. It is his strict definition of what constitutes as evidence towards his opposition that morphs Atun Shei from a person who claims to be presenting history in an entertaining fashion into what he truly is, an ideologue. Following all of this, he mentions the following.
In the summer of 1864, during Jubal Early's raid of Pennsylvania, the slave of one Captain Robert Park escaped. Park later wrote that
he must have been in Tastaway or forcibly detained by some Negro worshipper, as he had always been prompt and faithful, and seemed much attached to me.
like, it never occurred to this man that his slave may have just been feigning his affections, biding his time, waiting for an opportunity to get the fuck out of there.
Alright, hear me out. Maybe, just maybe, he trusted this man and felt betrayed by him for running away. Not everyone can read a person's mind, something that Atun Shei thinks he can do whenever he wants to. This is an act of betrayal that I can come to understand, where you think someone cares about you, but in reality, all they care about is their own selfish interests. It isn't that these people were delusional or not bright, but that they actually cared about their servants as, well, people. This goes back to my earlier point on Atun Shei being unable to separate his political perceptions from the human aspect behind all of these things. Politically, yes, it would not be unexpected for someone under bondage to seek to escape from that bondage. Yet, on a personal level, it can only be seen as betrayal of that sense of trust built between two individuals, who likely knew one another for their whole lives, and a betrayal of the ideal of what someone in the situation of either a servant or a master ought act. I can hear some viewers asking me, but Boots, they were a slave. Shouldn't it be right for them to run away and gain their freedom at any cost? The issue I have is not whether slavery is moral or not. The issue I have is the inherently selfish nature behind the act. It is a breach in a person's sense of trust, the destruction of a personal bond through an act that is, in the end, inherently selfish. It is no different to how a wife might cheat on their husband, or a friend spreading a malicious lie about you. You have placed considerable trust in that person, a strong sense of belief that they will remain loyal to you, which in turn you reciprocate by being loyal to them by treating them with a sense of respect, humility, and compassion. Regardless of the social circumstances, you have to act in a fashion that is moral, in a form that no man can ever criticize. I cannot criticize men, such as Silas, because they did nothing truly wrong. I can only admire Silas because, in spite of his standing in society, he proved himself worthy of respect and admiration. I cannot say the same about servants who ran away and broke the trust of their masters, as the action of breaking that trust is no more moral than the institution he sought to flee from. After referencing runaways, he goes on to say the following.
If we Confederates loved racism so much, why did we invite these black men to reunions? Why did we adorn them in medals and honors? It's right there in black and white. You know, Johnny, it's really amazing. You're so knowledgeable about the Civil War. I ought to be. I fought in it. You and your fellow Lost Causers could rattle off the entire order of battle at Lookout Mountain by heart. You could tell me exactly how to hook up the shoulder boards on a general's frock. You know the number of mini balls that can fit into a standard issue cartridge box. So it's shocking how unbelievably ignorant you are of all of Southern history outside of those 4 little years of rebellion.
This is simply an insult, not just directed at his straw man, but to everyone who dare criticize his poor presentation of historical events. The attitude presented here is slimy and underhanded, as it is directly insulting the intelligence and knowledge of those he is trying to dismiss. It is this condescending attitude that has been the bane of discussions regarding the war or any historical events pertaining to the South for the past 10 years. This scene is a mask-off moment, revealing what he truly thinks about those who speak against his bad arguments and bad historiography. He sees you, me, and every person whom he disagrees with as idiots. He hates each and every one of us who dare to speak out against him. Yet, he doesn't leave it there. He continues, stating the following.
We shouldn't be at all surprised that former camp slaves were welcomed and honored at Confederate veterans events, especially from the 1920s on. It was the height of Jim Crow, and an important justification for segregation was that black people were being oppressed for their own good. Unlike the lost cause myth of today, which tries to paint the Confederacy as some sort of egalitarian paradise, the lost cause myth of the early 20th century maintained that blacks had been better off as slaves, and that the best hope for black Americans going forward was for them to defer to white authority. But during World War I, black Southern soldiers had been treated more or less as equals in Europe, and saw firsthand that a desegregated society was possible. Consequently, upon returning home, they aggressively fought for their rights. Many white Southerners fought back, both with violence and propaganda. Not every black Southerner was quite so radical. In fact, their politics were pretty neatly divided along generational lines. Younger black people were avowed agitators. Older black people, including many former slaves, were content not to rock the boat. Their deference gave the white elite the exact ammunition they needed to counter the activist narrative. So when former camp slaves appeared at Confederate veterans events, they were placed front and center as ideal examples of well-behaved blacks.
Firstly, most of what he said here can only be described as buzzword salad. Most of it is meaningless minutia that has no real meaning outside of being catchy buzzwords. Most notably, the dropping of the term lost cause myth. A term coined by the cynical historian some years back, is nothing more than a catch-all term referring to any viewpoint of the war that speaks from the Southern perspective of the conflict. The meaning of it has no inherent meaning, as no one can provide a solid definition for it. Even Atun Shei has to point out that said term has changed in its meaning over the years, making the terminology rather meaningless. Even so, such beliefs were contradicted by members of the United Confederate Veterans, such as Julius Howell, who explicitly stated that slavery was bad and that it was good that it had been ended. And no, on certain terms, the term is meaningless drivel that has no value in any real discussion. It is no different than throwing out the term racist or sexist to describe someone. They, too, have no inherent meaning anymore, as they have become catch-all terms to refer to anyone who does not hold the specific progressive tenets as the absolute truth. Secondly, his point about black Confederates appearing at veterans' meetings doesn't make sense whatsoever. Black men were appearing in UCV meetings as far back as the late 19th century. For example, there's this photo, which was taken in 1907 during a Confederate veterans meeting in Richmond, Virginia. There's the example of Jefferson Shields, a black servant who acted as a cook of Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson during the war. Here we see several photographs taken of him in 1908 wearing a considerable number of awards given to him over the years. Then there's the case of Henry "Dad" Brown, a free black man from Darlington, South Carolina. He had acted as a drummer during the Mexican-American War before taking up the position again as a part of the 8th South Carolina Regiment, a regiment that fought with the Army of Northern Virginia during the war until the end of the conflict. He would retire back to his hometown before taking up his role as drummer one last time during the Spanish-American War in 1898, making him one of the few men to serve in all 3 of these wars. Here, he is pictured in 1905, posing with his drum he had allegedly used during the war. I could mention further examples, such as the Black Confederates who attended the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. But at this point, it should be abundantly clear that Atun Shei either has no clue what he's talking about, or, worse off, is telling his audience bold-faced lies. These men were already well liked, if not outright beloved, by both black and white men from the communities they lived in. To touch upon Henry Brown, once again, when he passed away in 1907, his funeral was attended by both black and white men of Darlington, South Carolina, and his pallbearers consisted of both black and white men. Atun Shei not only told his audience a bold-faced lie, he crafted an outright narrative to express his sentiments through. Nothing he said here was factual, but ideological. There is clear evidence that the UCV was accepting these black individuals well before the First World War, and that this acceptance was not motivated by political ideology. It was motivated by mutual respect, if not outright reverence for these men and their good deeds. Atun Shei is so heavily blinded by his ideological beliefs that he cannot see the obvious, assuming he would even wish to see it at all. And yet, it only gets worse from there. He then goes on to do, well, this.
And we can kind of see why that makes sense. We just put ourselves in their shoes for a second. We can really understand that the
Lord, give me the strength to resist the Yankee invader, the violator of our homes and firesides. Let me destroy him with facts and logic, Lord. I am your humble servant.
Hello there.
Lord, is that really you? It's a Christmas miracle.
Yes, it's me. But I wasn't really born on Christmas. It's a vile pagan carnival, and everyone who celebrates it is going to hell.
Is it my day to be with you, Lord? If so, I come to you with all the joy in my heart.
No, Johnny. I have come to answer your prayers. Take this. It is a book of primary sources to counter Billy's arguments.
So says?
Yes. Now go, my son. Go boldly into the combat. And remember, Catholics and Quakers worship the devil and should be killed.
I'll remember, Lord.
You are wise and strong, and I am very proud of you. Goodbye.
When I saw this, all I felt was a sense of disgust. This is the same tired humor that Atun Shei in every single lowly adult animated show has made for the past 30 years. Making fun of Christianity and the Christian faith has become not only tiring, but downright sickening. To add to this, when I watched this, I and my family had suffered a recent tragedy with the passing of my grandfather. He was a deeply faithful man and someone I deeply loved, and seeing Atun Shei make a mockery of his faith, my faith, in such a lowbrow, ignorant fashion fills me with contempt for the man. This little skit is one of the most insulting things he has done in this series. One of the most vacuous, unfunny things he has ever made. It's him beating on a dead horse and showing his sheer ignorance when it comes to the Christian faith. And yet, this man wants to insult me and anyone who disagrees with him by saying we're ignorant and have no understanding of history beyond the war. This man, who spends his time overtly lying to his audience and propagating narratives he and his sources have constructed whole cloth, wishes to tell me that I am wrong? The video goes on from here, but honestly, I have no desire to respond to anything else. Even so, all he does is repeat the same tired arguments that I've heard already and responded to earlier on, meaning I see no need to continue on from here. There's nothing worth responding to. Wait, why do I hear loud Christmas music? Mr. Nini?
Yes?
Did you set up all of this that quickly?
Like I said, Bootsy, you underestimate me.
Wait, why is there a coffin in the living room? And why does it smell like formaldehyde?
That's Jacob Marley, Bootsy. Duh!
Why did you dig up Jacob Marley?
I didn't dig him up, dum-dum. Mr. Cow did.
I miss me old buddy snatching days. You know that's illegal, right?
Nothing's illegal if you don't get caught, Bootsy.
Wait, you invited Mr. Crow as well?
I'm just here for the eggnog. Come on. Yes, it's Christmas after all.
It's July.
Yes, Christmas in July. Duh. Bootsy, I know you've had a rough time. Just relax a bit and enjoy some fun.
Yeah, there's no harm in having a little fun. You're right. Did you guys make some Christmas cookies?
Yes, have a dozen.